Daniel Warner gripped the leather steering wheel of his black Mercedes, staring blankly at the glowing screen of his phone. Another email, another crisis, another demand for his immediate attention. At 42 years old, he had everything most people dreamed of. A tech company worth over $1 billion, a mansion in the hills, expensive cars lined up in his garage. But sitting there in that luxury vehicle, he felt completely hollow inside. His assistant had scheduled back-to-back meetings for the entire day. The board members were angry about the latest product delays. His investors wanted answers he didn't have. And somewhere in the chaos of his calendar, he'd missed his daughter Lily's school play last week. Again. She hadn't even bothered to call him about it this time. The silence hurt more than her anger used to. Daniel's doctor had warned him just 3 days ago that his blood pressure was dangerously high. The man had looked at him with genuine concern and said something Daniel couldn't forget. "You're building an empire, but destroying yourself in the process. What's the point of having everything if you're not alive to enjoy it?" Daniel had nodded, promised to slow down, and then immediately rushed to another meeting. His marriage had fallen apart 2 years ago. Victoria had tried to make it work, really tried, but how do you stay married to someone who's never actually present? Someone who checks emails during dinner, takes calls during vacations, and falls asleep reviewing spreadsheets? She'd finally said she felt like a widow to a man who was still alive. The divorce papers sat signed in his lawyer's office. Daniel stepped out of his car, the autumn wind hitting his face with unexpected coldness. He'd parked outside his usual coffee shop, the place where he conducted informal meetings and pretended to be just another customer instead of the CEO everyone wanted something from. He needed caffeine, maybe 2 shots of espresso, maybe 3. But then he heard it, piano music, floating through the air like something from another world entirely. Daniel froze mid-step. The melody was unlike anything playing on the radio or streaming services. It wasn't polished or perfect. It was raw, emotional, and somehow heartbreaking. Every note seemed to carry weight, telling a story without words. The sound pulled at something deep inside him. Something he'd forgotten existed beneath all the business plans and profit margins. He followed the music like a person in a trance, his expensive shoes clicking against the sidewalk. Other pedestrians rushed past him, earbuds in, faces buried in phones, completely oblivious to the beautiful sound filling the air. How could they not hear it? How could they not stop? The music led him to Harrison Park, a small green space wedged between towering office buildings. And there, under a large oak tree just beginning to shed its golden leaves, sat the source of the melody. An old upright piano stood on the concrete, its wood scratched and faded, its keys yellowed with age. And playing it was a man who looked like he'd been forgotten by the world. His clothes were layered and mismatched, a heavy jacket over what appeared to be 2 or 3 shirts, pants that had seen better days, boots held together with duct tape. His hair was gray and tangled, his beard long and unkempt. A worn backpack and a sleeping bag sat beside the piano bench. The man was homeless. That much was obvious. But the way he played that piano, it was like watching magic happen in real time. His eyes were closed, his weathered face completely peaceful despite the obvious hardness of his life. His fingers moved across the keys with impossible grace, dancing through complex passages that would challenge even professional pianists. The music swelled and fell, spoke and sang, cried and laughed. It told a story that Daniel could feel in his chest, even though he couldn't put that story into words. Daniel had attended charity galas where world-class musicians performed. He'd been to symphonies and concerts, always checking his phone, always thinking about work. But this was different. This music reached inside him and touched something he thought had died years ago. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 10 or 12 people forming a loose semicircle around the pianist. Some looked like office workers on their lunch break. Others might have been homeless themselves. A young couple held hands, swaying slightly. An elderly woman had tears running down her weathered cheeks. Daniel found himself blinking rapidly, his vision blurring. Were those tears? When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't even remember. Not at his divorce. Not when his father had his heart attack last year. Not when Lily had screamed that she wished he wasn't her dad. He'd just buried everything deeper and worked harder. But this music, it was breaking through all of that. The piece came to an end, the final notes hanging in the air like morning mist before slowly fading away. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the small crowd erupted in applause. The pianist opened his eyes, looking almost surprised to find people watching. He nodded shyly, a small smile appearing beneath his beard. People started dropping money into an old coffee can beside the piano. Quarters, dollar bills, whatever they had. Daniel reached for his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill. He walked forward, feeling suddenly self-conscious in his expensive suit, and dropped it into the can. The bill fluttered down, landing on top of the smaller denominations like a foreign object. The pianist glanced at the can, then looked up at Daniel. Their eyes met for just a second. The man's eyes were a striking blue-gray, clear and intelligent despite his weathered appearance. There was no gratitude in his gaze, no desperation, just a simple acknowledgement. One human seeing another. Then the pianist turned back to his instrument and began to play again. Something different this time. Faster, more playful, with hints of jazz woven through classical structures. The crowd dispersed. People returning to their lives, their jobs, their routines. But Daniel couldn't move. He stood there for almost 45 minutes, completely forgetting about his coffee, his meetings, his buzzing phone. He just listened. And for the first time in what felt like forever, his mind went quiet. All the noise, the demands, the pressure, the endless mental calculations, it all just stopped. When the pianist finally took a break, stretching his fingers and reaching for a bottle of water beside the piano, Daniel found himself walking closer. "That was incredible," he said, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "I've never heard anything like it." The pianist looked at him, seeming to really see him this time. "Thank you," he replied. His voice was educated, refined even, not what Daniel had expected. "It's one of my own compositions. I call it Memories of What Could Have Been. You composed that." Daniel couldn't hide his amazement. "Are you a professional musician?" A sad smile crossed the man's face. "Was a lifetime ago. Now I'm just someone who plays piano in parks." Daniel wanted to ask more. How did this happen? What changed? What's your story? But something in the man's expression stopped him. There was dignity there beneath the rough exterior. This wasn't someone who wanted pity or interrogation. "I'm Theodore," the pianist said, extending a hand that was surprisingly clean despite his circumstances. "Daniel," he replied, shaking it. The man's grip was firm, his calluses evidence of years spent playing. They didn't talk much more that day. Theodore played a few more pieces, Daniel listened, and then the afternoon faded into evening. As the sun began to set behind the office buildings, casting long shadows across the park, Theodore started packing up. Someone, probably park services, must have wheeled the piano out each morning and stored it somewhere at night. Daniel walked back to his car in a daze. He'd missed every single meeting on his calendar. His phone showed 47 unread messages and 12 missed calls. His assistant had texted, "Is everything okay?" The board is furious, but for the first time in years, Daniel didn't immediately panic. He sat in his car, engine off, just thinking, remembering how the music had made him feel, wondering about Theodore's story, questioning his own. That night, lying in his enormous bed in his enormous house, Daniel couldn't sleep. Not because of work stress, that was normal, but because he couldn't stop hearing that melody in his head, Memories of What Could Have Been. The title kept echoing through his thoughts. What could his life have been if he'd made different choices? If he'd prioritized people over profits? If he'd been present for the moments that actually mattered? And what about Theodore? What had he lost? What had brought him to playing piano in parks for spare change? As dawn broke through his bedroom windows, Daniel made a decision. He was going back to that park. He needed to hear that music again. He needed to understand why it affected him so deeply. He didn't know it yet, but that decision would change everything. Daniel found himself back at Harrison Park the next morning at 10 o'clock sharp. He'd canceled his first 3 meetings, telling his assistant he had a personal matter to attend to. She'd sounded shocked. Daniel never canceled meetings. but he didn't offer any explanation, just hung up and drove straight to the park. Theodore was already there, sitting on the piano bench, but not yet playing. He was eating something from a paper bag, looking out at the morning joggers and dog walkers passing through the park. When he noticed Daniel approaching, a flicker of recognition crossed his weathered face, followed by something that looked like caution. "You came back," Theodore said simply, wrapping up what remained of his breakfast. "I couldn't stop thinking about your music," Daniel admitted, feeling oddly vulnerable, making this confession to a stranger. "That piece you played yesterday, it stayed with me all night." Theodore studied him for a long moment, those clear blue-gray eyes seeming to look right through Daniel's expensive suit and into something deeper. "Music does that sometimes. Gets inside you and won't let go. It's how you know it's real." Daniel stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't used to situations where his money and status meant nothing. In his world, people always wanted something from him. Investments, partnerships, jobs, connections. But Theodore just sat there, neither welcoming nor dismissing his presence. Would you mind if I listened again today?" Daniel finally asked. Theodore shrugged, a gesture that seemed to say, "It's a public park," and turned to the piano. His fingers found the keys, and within seconds, music filled the morning air. This piece was different from yesterday's, more hopeful somehow, with bright notes that sparkled like sunlight on water. Daniel sat down on a nearby bench, setting down the coffee he'd brought for himself. As Theodore played, the park came alive around them. A young mother pushed a stroller past, slowing down to listen. An elderly man walking his dog stopped completely, standing there with a smile on his face. Even the pigeons seemed to gather closer, pecking at the ground in rhythm with the melody. This became Daniel's routine. Every morning for a week, he showed up at the park. He'd bring 2 coffees now, one for himself and one for Theodore, though it took 3 days before the pianist would accept it. He'd also bring pastries from the bakery near his office, sandwiches, fruit. Theodore never asked for any of it, but Daniel noticed he always ate whatever was offered. They didn't talk much at first. Theodore would play for a few hours, taking breaks to rest his fingers or drink water. Daniel would listen, occasionally checking his phone, but finding himself increasingly able to ignore it. The emails and messages that once seemed so urgent now felt distant and less important. On the 8th day, during one of Theodore's breaks, Daniel finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "How did you end up here?" "Playing in parks, I mean. You're clearly trained. I can hear it in every note you play." Theodore took a long sip of his coffee, looking out at the city skyline visible beyond the trees. For a moment, Daniel thought he wouldn't answer. Then the older man began to speak. "I went to Juilliard," Theodore said quietly. "Full scholarship. I was going to be the next great concert pianist. That's what everyone told me anyway. My teachers, my parents, the critics who heard me play. I had my whole life mapped out before I even turned 21. He paused, his fingers absently tapping against his knee, as if playing invisible keys. But pressure does strange things to people. I started drinking to calm my nerves before performances. Just a little at first, then more. Then I couldn't perform without it. By the time I was 25, I'd missed 3 major concerts because I was too drunk to play. My agent dropped me. The invitations stopped coming. Daniel listened without interrupting, recognizing something in Theodore's story that felt uncomfortably familiar. The pressure, the expectations, the slow spiral of trying to cope with it all. I told myself I'd stop drinking and make a comeback. Theodore continued. But addiction doesn't work that way. I lost my apartment, then my piano, then everything else. My family tried to help at first, but I kept lying to them, stealing from them, disappointing them. Eventually, they had to cut me off. My son was 12 the last time I saw him. He's 37 now. The pain in Theodore's voice was raw and real. Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "I've been sober for 6 years now," Theodore said, and there was a hint of pride in his voice. "Found a good support group at a church downtown, but being sober doesn't erase 25 years of bad decisions. Doesn't bring back the career or the family or the life I could have had. All I have left is the music. That's the one thing I never truly lost, even when I lost everything else." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Theodore's story hanging in the air between them. Then Daniel found himself talking, words spilling out that he'd never said to anyone. "I have a daughter," he began. "Lily, she's 15. Last month she told me she didn't want me at her birthday party because I'd just spend the whole time on my phone anyway." She was right. "That's exactly what I would have done." Theodore turned to look at him, really look at him, and Daniel continued. "I built this company from nothing. I worked 18-hour days for years. I told myself it was all for my family, to give them a good life, security, everything they could want. But somewhere along the way, I forgot to actually be present for them. My ex-wife, Victoria, she tried so hard to make me understand. But I was always chasing the next deal, the next milestone, the next billion." "You divorced?" Theodore asked gently. 2 years ago, she got tired of being married to a ghost, and I couldn't even blame her. I was so focused on building my empire that I didn't notice I was destroying everything that actually mattered." Daniel laughed bitterly. "My doctor says my stress levels are going to kill me before I'm 50. My daughter barely speaks to me. My parents call and I don't answer because I'm too busy. For what? So I can have more money I don't have time to spend? So I can buy things that don't make me happy?" Theodore nodded slowly, understanding written across his face. "Different paths, same emptiness." "Exactly," Daniel said, grateful that someone finally understood. "When I heard you playing that first day, your music reached something inside me that I thought was dead. It reminded me that I used to feel things, used to care about things beyond profit margins and stock prices." Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. A genuine friendship formed between these two men from completely different worlds. Daniel kept coming back to the park, and Theodore gradually opened up more. They talked about music, about life, about regrets and dreams. Theodore told stories about his glory days at Juilliard, the legendary teachers he'd studied with, the pieces that had challenged and changed him. Daniel shared memories of his early startup days when he'd been excited and passionate before the business consumed him completely. "You know what I miss most?" Theodore said one afternoon. "Creating. Not just playing other people's compositions, but writing my own. That's when I feel most alive, when I'm bringing something new into the world that never existed before." "You still compose?" Daniel asked, intrigued. "All the time. Up here." Theodore tapped his temple. "And sometimes I can work things out on pianos like this one. But I've written dozens of pieces that exist only in my head because I've never had the chance to properly record or transcribe them. They'll die with me, I suppose." This thought bothered Daniel more than he wanted to admit. The idea that Theodore's music, something so beautiful and meaningful, might disappear forever seemed fundamentally wrong. One evening, Daniel brought his laptop to the park. "I want to record you," he said. "Just on my phone." "Would that be okay?" The conference room exploded with voices. Board members stood up, shouting over each other. Someone slammed their hand on the polished table. The chairman's face turned red as he demanded Daniel explain himself. But through all the chaos, Daniel sat perfectly calm, a slight smile on his face. "You can't be serious," the chairman finally said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Daniel, you built this company from nothing. It's worth over $1 billion. You're walking away from everything you've worked for?" "I'm not walking away," Daniel corrected, his voice steady. "I'm stepping back. I'll remain as chairman of the board, still invested in the company's success, but I'm handing daily operations to someone better suited for it right now. My COO, Patricia, has been running things brilliantly for the past 2 months while I've been otherwise occupied. Promote her? She's earned it, and honestly, she's better at the job than I've been lately." "This is insane," another board member interjected. "You're having some kind of breakdown. Take a vacation, see a therapist, but don't make a decision like this when you're clearly not thinking straight." Daniel leaned forward, his eyes meeting each person around the table. "I've never been thinking more clearly in my life. For 15 years, I poured everything into this company. I sacrificed my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, my health, my happiness. And yes, we built something successful. But what's the point of building an empire if you're too empty to enjoy it?" He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "I'm not abandoning ship. I'm choosing to live while I'm still alive. The company will be fine, better than fine. You have brilliant people here who've been carrying more weight than anyone realizes. Trust them. Trust Patricia. and trust that sometimes the best decision a leader can make is knowing when to step aside. Walking out of that boardroom felt like shedding a 1,000-pound weight. Daniel's phone immediately started buzzing with calls and texts from board members, investors, and business partners. He turned it off completely, something he'd never done in 15 years, and drove straight to the recording studio. Theodore was in the middle of recording when Daniel arrived. Through the glass, he could see the older man lost in his music, eyes closed, fingers dancing across the piano keys. The cellist and violinist played alongside him, and the sound engineer was nodding along, a huge grin on his face. When the piece ended and Theodore came out for a break, he immediately noticed something different about Daniel. "What happened? You look like you just won the lottery." "Better," Daniel said, unable to stop smiling. "I quit. Well, not quit exactly, but I stepped down as CEO. I'm free, Theodore." "Actually free?" Theodore's eyes widened. "That's a pretty big decision." "Are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've been about anything in years," Daniel replied. "You know what I realized sitting in that boardroom? I was so busy building something I thought mattered that I forgot to build a life worth living. You taught me that. Your music, your story, your second chance at creating despite everything you lost, it showed me what really matters." Over the next few months, Daniel threw himself into the album project with the same intensity he'd once reserved for business deals. But this felt different. This filled him with energy instead of draining it. He worked with publicists, connected with music journalists, and used his business network in entirely new ways, not to make money, but to share something beautiful with the world. The album, titled Songs from the Street, was completed in early December. Daniel held the final master recording in his hands like it was made of gold. 12 original compositions, each one a masterpiece, each one carrying Theodore's story and soul. But Daniel had one more idea, something he'd been planning for weeks. He'd recorded video of Theodore playing in Harrison Park months ago, back when he'd first started listening. Now he hired a professional editor to create a short documentary piece, just 10 minutes long, showing Theodore's journey from homeless pianist to recording artist. The video opened with footage of Theodore playing the worn piano in the park, wearing his old layered clothes, his beard untrimmed. The music was hauntingly beautiful, and the contrast between the musician's appearance and the sophistication of his playing was striking. Then it cut to interviews with Theodore talking about his past, his struggles, his love for music that never died even when everything else fell apart. The second half showed the recording studio sessions, Theodore's transformation, and the creation of the album. It ended with him playing the title track, Songs from the Street, a piece that somehow captured both the pain of homelessness and the triumph of survival. Daniel posted the video on YouTube on a Friday afternoon with a simple title, From Park Bench to Recording Studio, One Homeless Man's Musical Journey. He shared it on social media, sent it to a few journalists he'd connected with, and then waited. By Saturday morning, the video had 10,000 views. By Sunday, it had 500,000. By Monday, it had crossed 5 million, and major news outlets were calling, wanting to interview both Theodore and Daniel. The video had struck something deep in people. Comments poured in by the thousands. "I'm sitting at my desk crying," one person wrote. "This is what humanity should be about." Another said, "I've been homeless. Nobody sees you. Nobody treats you like you matter. This video made me believe in people again." Music critics who watched the video tracked down the album and gave it glowing reviews. "A stunning debut from an artist who should have been famous decades ago," wrote one prominent reviewer. "Theodore's compositions are masterful, complex, emotional, and utterly unique. This is what music sounds like when it comes from a life fully lived, with all its pain and beauty." The album released 2 weeks later and debuted at number 7 on the classical charts. For an independent release from an unknown artist, it was extraordinary. More importantly, people were listening, really listening. Theodore's music was reaching people in their cars, their homes, their offices, touching hearts, just like it had touched Daniel's that first day in the park. But Theodore didn't let the success change what mattered most to him. He used his growing platform to talk about homelessness, about addiction, about mental health, about the invisible people society walks past every day. He gave interviews where he spoke honestly about his mistakes and his recovery, becoming a voice for people who rarely got heard. Daniel helped Theodore establish a foundation, Second Chance Melodies, dedicated to supporting homeless artists and musicians. They partnered with shelters, provided instruments and music lessons, and created programs to help people experiencing homelessness reconnect with their creative talents. Every Saturday, Theodore still went back to Harrison Park to play the same worn piano. But now, crowds of 50 or 60 people gathered to listen. News crews came to film. But Theodore insisted on keeping the tradition alive because, as he told Daniel, "That park saved my life. That piano gave me purpose when I had nothing else. I won't forget where I came from." Daniel's relationship with Lily transformed completely. She started coming to the studio regularly, not just to listen, but to learn. Theodore became a mentor to her, teaching her not just technique, but the emotional honesty that makes music meaningful. She started composing her own pieces, and the pride on Daniel's face when he heard them was impossible to miss. One evening, Victoria came to pick up Lily from the studio and found herself staying to listen. Afterward, she pulled Daniel aside. "I don't know what happened to you, but this is the man I married. The one who cared about things, who was present, who was alive." "I got lost," Daniel admitted, "but Theodore's music helped me find my way back." Victoria smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I'm glad you found your way. Lily is too, even if she won't admit it. She talks about these Saturdays all week long." The moment that meant the most to Theodore came 6 months after the album's release. Daniel had been working on something secretly, hiring a private investigator to track down Theodore's son, Nathan. It took weeks of careful searching, but they finally found him, a 37-year-old architect living in Seattle with a wife and 2 children. Daniel reached out carefully, explaining the situation, sending the video and music. Nathan was hesitant at first. He carried years of hurt from his father's addiction and abandonment. But he agreed to watch and listen. When he called back 3 days later, his voice was thick with emotion. Daniel arrived at Harrison Park earlier than usual, his heart pounding with nervous energy. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with an idea that seemed crazy and brilliant in equal measure. In his hands, he carried 2 coffees and a folder containing something that could change everything or completely fall apart. Theodore was already at the piano, playing softly as the morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves. A few early commuters had stopped to listen, dropping coins into the coffee can before hurrying off to their jobs. When Theodore spotted Daniel approaching, he finished his piece and turned with a warm smile that had become familiar over the past month. "You're early today," Theodore observed, accepting the coffee Daniel offered. "I couldn't wait," Daniel admitted, sitting down on the bench beside the piano. His expensive suit felt out of place as always, but he'd stopped caring what people thought. "Theodore, I have a proposition for you, and I need you to hear me out before you say no." Theodore's expression shifted to cautious curiosity. Over the weeks, he'd learned that Daniel wasn't like other wealthy people who occasionally took interest in him. There was no superiority, no pity in Daniel's eyes, just genuine respect and friendship. "I want to help you record an album," Daniel said, the words tumbling out quickly. "A full professional album of your original compositions. I'll cover all the costs, studio time, musicians if you need them, production, everything. But this isn't charity, Theodore. The world needs to hear your music. What you create, it's extraordinary and it deserves to be preserved and shared." Theodore stared at him, his weathered face unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "Daniel, I appreciate the thought, I really do. But I've been down this road before. People make promises. They have good intentions. Then reality hits and everything falls apart. I can't handle that disappointment again." "This is different," Daniel insisted, pulling papers from his folder. "Look, I've already researched studios. I've contacted producers. I'm not some stranger making empty promises after hearing you play once. I've been coming here every day for 5 weeks. I've heard dozens of your pieces. I've watched people stop in their tracks when you play. This isn't about me feeling good about myself. This is about your music deserving to exist beyond this park." Theodore's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the papers. Daniel could see the war happening inside him, hope battling against years of disappointment and failure. "Why?" Theodore finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for me?" Daniel took a deep breath, surprised by the emotion rising in his chest. "Because your music saved me. I was drowning in my own success, completely disconnected from anything real or meaningful. Then I heard you play, and something inside me woke up. You reminded me that beauty and purpose still exist in this world. If your music could do that for me, imagine what it could do for others." There was a long silence. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening on the park bench. Finally, Theodore spoke. "I'm scared, Daniel. What if I fail again? What if I'm not good enough anymore?" "You're more than good enough," Daniel said firmly. "And you won't be alone this time. I'll be there every step of the way. Not as some distant benefactor, but as your friend. We'll do this together." Theodore looked down at his calloused hands, fingers that had played countless melodies over 6 decades. When he looked back up, there were tears in his blue-gray eyes. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay, let's try." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel rented time at a premier recording studio across town, the kind of place where famous musicians recorded their albums. He hired sound engineers who came highly recommended, but agreed to work on Theodore's project, specifically because Daniel showed them the phone, recordings, and they were genuinely moved by the music. The first day at the studio was overwhelming for Theodore. He stood in the lobby, staring at the platinum records on the walls, looking completely out of place in his worn clothes. Daniel noticed his discomfort immediately. "Hey," Daniel said quietly, pulling Theodore aside. "You belong here more than most people who've walked through these doors. Your music has soul, real genuine soul. That's rarer than you think." They'd also addressed Theodore's appearance, though Daniel had been careful about how he approached it. "The studio has showers and a place to freshen up," he'd mentioned casually. "And I brought some clothes that might be more comfortable. Just some things that don't fit me anymore." It was a lie. Daniel had bought them specifically for Theodore, but he knew the older man's pride would make him refuse charity. Theodore had accepted gratefully, and the transformation was remarkable. Clean-shaven, with trimmed hair and fresh clothes, he looked 10 years younger. But more importantly, he carried himself differently, shoulders back, head held high. The dignity that had always been there was now visible to everyone. The recording sessions became the center of Daniel's life. He started arriving at his office later and leaving earlier, delegating more and more to his capable executive team. His assistant Jennifer had worked for him for 8 years and couldn't believe the change she was witnessing. "Mr. Warner, the board wants to schedule a meeting about the third-quarter projections," she said one afternoon. "Tell them I'll review everything and send my notes by email," Daniel replied, gathering his things. "I have somewhere I need to be." Jennifer's eyes widened. The old Daniel would have dropped everything for a board meeting. "Is everything all right, sir?" Daniel paused at the door, a genuine smile crossing his face. "Actually, Jennifer, everything is better than it's been in years." At the studio, Daniel watched Theodore work with professional musicians, a cellist, a violinist, and a talented young guitarist who jumped at the chance to work on the project. Theodore was nervous at first, worried that his compositions weren't sophisticated enough or that his years away from professional music would show. But something magical happened when he sat at the grand piano in the studio. All the doubt melted away, replaced by pure creative energy. His fingers found the keys and music poured out, complex, emotional, absolutely beautiful. The other musicians watched in awe, then joined in, their instruments weaving around Theodore's piano like conversations between old friends. Daniel sat in the control room watching through the glass and felt something shift inside him. This was what life was supposed to be about. Not endless meetings and profit margins, but creating something meaningful, connecting with people, making a real difference. "This is incredible," the sound engineer whispered beside him. "I've worked with Grammy winners who don't have this kind of raw, emotional honesty. Where has this guy been?" "Waiting," Daniel said simply. "Just waiting for a second chance." During breaks, Daniel and Theodore would talk for hours. Theodore shared stories about specific pieces, what inspired them, what he was feeling when he composed them. One piece, called Lost Son, was written for the child he hadn't seen in 25 years. Another, Second Morning, represented his first day of sobriety. Daniel opened up too, talking about his fractured relationship with Lily, his regrets about his marriage, his slowly dawning realization that success without connection was just expensive loneliness. Theodore listened with the same attention he brought to music, offering wisdom earned through hard experience. "You still have time," Theodore told him one evening as they left the studio. "I lost 25 years to addiction and bad choices. My son is grown, has his own family I've never met. But Lily is 15. She's still there, Daniel. Still reachable. Don't waste this opportunity thinking there's always tomorrow." Those words hit Daniel hard. That night, instead of going home to his empty mansion, he drove to Victoria's house where Lily lived. His ex-wife answered the door, surprise evident on her face. "Daniel, it's 9 o'clock. Is something wrong?" "Is Lily awake?" "I really need to talk to her." Victoria studied him for a moment, noting something different in his demeanor. "She's doing homework." "Come in." Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, suspicious and guarded. "What do you want, Dad?" "I wanted to ask if you'd come to the recording studio this Saturday," Daniel said. "Theodore, the pianist I told you about, he's recording an album. I thought you might like to see how it's done. Maybe even meet him." Lily crossed her arms, her teenage defenses firmly in place. "You're actually going to show up?" "Not cancel at the last minute because of some important meeting?" The words stung, but Daniel accepted them. "I'll be there. I promise. This is important to me, and I think it might be important to you, too. No phone, no work, just us and the music." Something in Lily's expression softened slightly. "Fine. But if you cancel, don't bother asking me to do anything with you ever again." "Deal," Daniel agreed, relief washing over him. Saturday came, and for the first time in memory, Daniel didn't check his work email even once that morning. He picked up Lily from Victoria's house, and they drove to the studio in comfortable silence, punctuated by occasional small talk about school and friends. When they arrived, Theodore was already at the piano warming up. He looked up as they entered, and his face broke into a warm smile. "You must be Lily. Your father talks about you constantly." Lily glanced at Daniel with surprise, then back at Theodore. "He does?" "All the time," Theodore confirmed. "Says you play piano, too." "I'd love to hear you sometime." What followed was one of the best days of Daniel's life. He watched his daughter's walls come down as Theodore played, as he explained his creative process, as he even invited her to try the studio's grand piano. Lily's fingers were hesitant at first, rusty from months of not playing, but soon she was working through a piece she'd learned years ago. Theodore listened intently, then offered gentle suggestions that somehow didn't feel like criticism. By the end of the session, Lily was smiling, really smiling, in a way Daniel hadn't seen in years. As they drove home, Lily turned to him. "Dad, that was actually really cool." "Theodore is amazing. Can we go back next week?" "Absolutely," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. But not everything was perfect. The following Monday, Daniel received an urgent summons to the boardroom. His board of directors sat around the conference table, their expressions grim. "Daniel, we need to talk about your recent behavior," the chairman began. "You've been absent from crucial meetings. You're delegating decisions that require your direct attention. Several major clients have complained about your unavailability. What's going on?" Daniel looked around the table at these people he'd worked with for years. They looked concerned, yes, but also frustrated and confused. And suddenly, with crystal clarity, he knew what he had to do. "I'm stepping down as CEO," he said calmly. The room erupted. Theodore hesitated, self-consciousness flickering across his face. "I'm not exactly in prime form these days. My fingers aren't as nimble as they used to be." "You're incredible," Daniel said firmly. "And I have someone I want to share your music with. My daughter, Lily. She plays piano too, or she used to. Maybe your music could reach her the way it reached me." Something in Daniel's voice must have convinced Theodore, because he nodded and turned to the piano. Daniel pulled out his phone and hit record as Theodore began to play one of his original compositions, a piece he called Echoes of Tomorrow. That night, Daniel sent the recording to Lily with a simple message. Found something beautiful today. Thought you might appreciate it. Love, Dad. He didn't expect a response. They'd barely communicated beyond logistical text messages for months. But 20 minutes later, his phone rang. Dad? Lily's voice sounded different, softer, more open than it had in years. Who is that playing? It's absolutely beautiful. It made me cry. Daniel felt his own eyes welling up. His name is Theodore. He plays in Harrison Park downtown. He's someone special. Would you want to meet him sometime? There was a pause, then Lily said something that made Daniel's heart skip. Yeah, I'd really like that. As Daniel lay in bed that night, he realized something had shifted. Theodore's music wasn't just changing him, it was starting to build bridges to the parts of his life he'd thought were permanently broken. And for the first time in years, he felt something that had been absent for far too long. Hope. The next morning, he arrived at the park with an idea that would change both their lives forever. But he had no idea yet just how far this journey would take them. Is he really sober? Really stable? Nathan asked. 6 years sober, Daniel confirmed. And yes, stable? He's not the man who left you, Nathan. He's someone who's fought his way back and wants a chance, just a chance, to reconnect. The reunion happened at the studio on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Daniel and Lily stayed in the background, giving them space. When Nathan walked in with his wife and 2 young children, Theodore stood frozen, tears streaming down his weathered face. Nathan, he whispered. You came. I listened to your album, Nathan said, his own voice breaking. I heard what you were saying in the music. All the regret, all the longing. Dad, I'm still angry about a lot of things. I'm not going to pretend 25 years of absence doesn't matter, but I heard you. Really heard you. Theodore nodded, not trying to defend himself or make excuses. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that not a single day passed where I didn't think about you, didn't regret what I lost. The music, it's all I have to offer. It's my truth, even when I couldn't speak it. Nathan's children, 8 and 5 years old, stared at the grandfather they'd never met. The younger one, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, walked up to Theodore shyly. Mommy says you play piano. Can you play something for me? Theodore looked at Nathan, who nodded permission. The old pianist sat down at the studio's grand piano, his hands shaking slightly as they found the keys. Then he played a piece he'd composed years ago, one he'd called Lullaby for a Lost Son, a gentle, heartbreaking melody that spoke of love and loss and hope. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Nathan walked over to his father, and they embraced for the first time in 25 years. It wasn't perfect, there was still so much to work through, so many conversations to have. But it was a beginning. A year after that first day in Harrison Park, Daniel stood at the back of a packed concert hall. Theodore was performing his first major concert, a full evening of his original compositions played by a professional ensemble. The tickets had sold out within hours, and the audience included everyone from classical music aficionados to people who'd been homeless themselves, given free tickets by the foundation. Lily sat in the front row next to Nathan and his family. Victoria was there too, and Daniel's parents, who'd flown in from across the country. Even some of Theodore's old friends from Juilliard had come. People who'd lost touch decades ago and were amazed to discover he was not only alive but thriving. As Theodore walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. He'd come so far from the forgotten man playing a worn piano in a park. But he'd also stayed true to himself, still humble, still grateful, still believing in the power of music to heal and connect. He sat at the piano, and the hall fell silent. Then his fingers touched the keys, and music filled the space, beautiful, complex, emotional, real. Daniel felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, successful but empty, rich but poor in all the ways that mattered. He thought about how close he'd come to missing this, to driving past that park, to staying locked in his Mercedes and his miserable life. Theodore's music had saved him, but in trying to help Theodore, Daniel had discovered something even more valuable: purpose, connection, and the simple truth that real wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock prices. It's measured in relationships restored, in beauty created and shared, in lives touched and changed. The concert ended with songs from the street, and the audience rose to their feet, applauding so long and so loud that Theodore had to wipe his eyes and bow 3 times before they'd let him leave the stage. Afterward, at the reception, people crowded around Theodore, thanking him, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival, telling him what his music meant to them. Daniel watched from across the room, content to stay in the background. Theodore caught his eye through the crowd and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." Daniel smiled and mouthed back, "Thank you." Because the truth was, they'd saved each other. One homeless pianist and one empty CEO had found exactly what they both needed: a second chance to create something beautiful, to live authentically, and to prove that it's never too late to change your life's melody. The story could have ended there, with triumph and celebration, but the real ending was quieter, more personal. It came 2 weeks later when Daniel, Lily, and Theodore sat together in Harrison Park. On the same bench where this journey had begun, the worn piano was still there, and Theodore played softly while early morning joggers passed by. Some stopped to listen. Others kept running, but the music kept playing, constant, beautiful, real. "You know what's funny?" Theodore said during a break. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. I was just existing day to day, waiting for the end. Now I have my son back. I have my music being heard. I have purpose again, all because you stopped to listen. And I have my daughter back," Daniel added, putting his arm around Lily, who leaned into him comfortably. "I have peace. I remember how to be happy, all because you kept playing even when nobody seemed to care." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up around them. The morning sun painted everything gold. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Life continued in all its messy, beautiful complexity. And in Harrison Park, under an oak tree, a melody continued, proof that sometimes the smallest act of attention, the simplest gesture of caring, can create ripples that change everything. The music played on,